Early on in the war, I was the commander of the Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force in Afghanistan called the CJ Uh, we controlled about 4,000 men, women, soldiers, sailors, airmen, marine from four different countries. So combined means multi-nation, joint means multi-service, and then special operations is what we did, the spectrum of special operations, and then a task force is a temporary organization for a specific mission. In this case, work in Afghanistan.
And how many U.S. forces did you have under your command?
It was built out around Third Special Forces Group, uh, which had at the time overseas I had two Green Beret battalions, and then roughly a battalion's worth of supporters. So I'd say uh, probably about 600 Americans, maybe up to 1,000, and it kind of peaked and valleyed over a 12-month period.
Okay.
But the majority of the numbers were coalition forces.
Coalition forces, and these were also special forces from the coalition nations.
Yes.
And what were the coalition nations that you worked with?
Well, a couple of them are coming and going, but at any given time, I had about six. My prime players, I had a battalion, a special forces battalion from the UAE, their
Uh,
first ever uh, non within UAE deployment. So they're pretty excited about that. I had a battalion of Czech Republic special forces soldiers. They had just joined NATO and did a great job working for me. I was very impressed with them. I had some from Netherlands. I had Jordanian uh, element, and then I had a couple of battalions of Afghan soldiers at any given time. And then I had two battalions of Green Berets.
what was your response to the events in Afghanistan in August 2021?
Uh, Probably like a lot of veterans, like a lot of Americans, or like anybody with any sense, absolute anger, frustration, shame, national shame, um, pain, pain. Uh, Really, from my perspective, it was the culmination of bad strategy. It started off and pretty good, but went downhill and just continued to go downhill all the way to tragedy, which is what we saw. Uh, so frustration, pain.
And I think you've just indicated the frustration wasn't, behind that frustration wasn't the idea that, we shouldn't have been there anyway. I mean, I don't think I've never heard anybody say we never should have done anything in response to the Taliban, but I've heard some say we just should have hit them really hard, but never really gone into the country. But it sounds like you're saying no, it was legitimate to go in, but the way we conducted the campaign, that's where the problem was.
Yeah, we didn't fight the war badly. We fought the war incorrectly. We fought it incorrectly for 20 years, and we fought it differently every year because we were constantly rotating people and therefore leaders and therefore ideas and therefore policies every year. So I think those two things really culminated in a failed policy. I argued as an unconventional warrior myself, the main effort from start to finish should have been by, with, and through the indigenous. The ideal war in Afghanistan would have had a minimal footprint of Americans and worked through the indige to get to our national goals. Our only national goals in Afghanistan should have been to mitigate Afghanistan as a launching point from which to attack our democracy. That morphed over time to try to turn Afghanistan into a Jeffersonian democracy, which just isn't feasible given their intellectual, or not intellectual, but their educational and cultural background. Not in any time soon, maybe 30, 40, 50 years, but not at this point. So I think that lack of simple, common strategy really culminated in the whole house of cards collapsing.
So I want to come back and walk through that. You mentioned in what you write, seeing these Soviet relics, these reminders of that decade the Soviet Union was there in Afghanistan, 79 to 89. Um, a lot of people think of it as the Soviet Union's, their own Vietnam experience. Um, First of all, did you see those Russian relics yourself? And when you saw them, did that, what role did that play in your thinking about how this war in Afghanistan should be prosecuted?
Yeah, great question. So yes, Soviet relics were all over the country. Every airfield we went to and we occupied, which were basically every airfield in the country, had rows of trashed junk Soviet airplanes with a big red star on their tail,
Wow.
but leaning over underside or wings chopped off to do something else. Every village we went through had Soviet tanks or artillery pieces, no longer running, of course, but just kind of stuck on the hillside. Of course, every compound we raided or went through had Soviet Discas, ZSU 23-4s, of course, AK-47s everywhere. So all that stuff really was a monument to a failed strategy. The Soviets tried to fight the Afghans like they fought the Germans, for example, in World War II, which was very much a force on force fist fight. And clearly, the Soviets, in most cases, beat them face to face. Not all cases, but they didn't fight it as as we should have, which is using the own indigenous frustration to overthrow the evil that was trying to impact us.
Mm,
So that,
sure.
it was interesting to see the Soviet things around there. And oh, by the way, the Afghans hate the Soviets. Now they argue amongst themselves and they don't like Americans, but they hate the Soviets. What the Taliban would tell uh, the locals that they were trying to co-opt is that we, the Americans, were just rich Russians. So
Mm,
think about that for a minute. We kind of look like Russians. We have
sure.
helicopters and vehicles and everything like Russians, yet we're exponentially more wealthy than the Russians are. So if the Taliban can convince the locals that the Americans and the coalition forces are just rich Russians, oh, that's all they need to know because we hate the Russians.
Well, and so then picking up on that, linking that to what you were saying a minute ago, of course, the overwhelming majority of Afghans can't understand what you're saying, and so they don't, they're just going by what they're seeing. And if what they're seeing looks a little bit like what they saw from the Russians, then maybe that would be a persuasive argument from the Taliban.
Absolutely, a bunch of predominantly European-looking guys driving big, heavy vehicles and helicopters and armored vehicles up and down the roads. Uh, Looks kind of like Russians.
Wow. So it's an interesting thesis in your memoir, and let me summarize it, and then let me know if I got the summary correct, and then I'm interested in you spelling it out. Um, you say that in Afghanistan, special forces um, were in support of conventional forces, but the way it should have been was for conventional forces to be in support of special forces in Afghanistan. So spell that out. What does that look like?
Yeah, I believe while we as the West, certainly the United States, didn't realize it, uh, we've been fighting a global unconventional war against terrorism. You remember it was called GWAT at the time, Global War on Terrorism, which is a good phrase. That is certainly a global event. It is certainly war, and we're certainly fighting evils of terrorists that cannot tolerate the way that you and I live and all of our family and loved ones live. But to put a finer tooth on it, it's really a global unconventional war. So to do that, you have to have unconventional thinking. You have to have an unconventional focus, uh, and then by all means bring in the bombers and the aircraft carriers and the tanks as needed. But they have to be in support of that unconventional perspective, not the other way around. When I say unconventional perspective, um, my favorite metaphor is Tom Sawyer, one of my heroes, and we all read Tom Sawyer as a kid. At the very opening chapter of the book, Mark Twain tells a story. Young Tom is tasked by his aunt to paint the fence, and Tom was a mischievous young Green Beret, and he didn't want to paint the fence. So what he did is get all of his neighbor kids and convince them to paint the fence. So that was a story, and that's really brilliant unconventional thinking because at the end, the fence got painted. All the neighborhood kids had bought into the idea that this fence needs to be white, and of course, Tom didn't get paint all over himself. And that's really the way we need to fight this global unconventional war against radical Islam. We need to get all the kids in the neighborhood to paint the fence, paint their own fence. We'll teach them, we'll coach them, we'll support them. And when need be, we'll kind of show them how to do it. But at the end of the day, they need to paint that fence. Otherwise, in a few years, it needs to be painted again. And that's kind of where we are. America, unfortunately, doesn't like that. We like the blitzkrieg style, even though that's a German phrase. America has very much adopted that.
Talking on.
We like to get in, I call it the McDonald philosophy. We want it in 2 minutes. We want it our way. We want it cooked just right, and then we're out of here. Uh, but in an Islamic world where they have the patience of Job, literally, or Muhammad, blitzkrieg does not work. You can't do blitzkrieg in an unconventional war. And I had that discussion with several senior leaders over there and since. And the fact is, it really doesn't matter. We like to do blitzkrieg, so that's what we're doing. I use the metaphor, we're playing football and they're playing soccer. So we're blocking and tackling. We've got passes, we've got field goals, but it doesn't matter because the game is soccer. But we like to play football, so that's what we're going to do.
Wow. What did you see? Let me just put it this way. I'll say I'm a officer that's senior to you and you're making this pitch to me and this is how we should operate. So my question back is, what are you seeing among the Afghan folks you're working with that you can latch on to so that they will, that they'll buy in? So here's something I see in them that we can latch onto and they can buy into the mission. What are you seeing that makes you think that's plausible?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, at the very core of humanity, Afghans want the same thing that you and I want. We want our families to be healthy and well fed. We want, a house, et cetera. When I first got over there and did what I call battlefield circulation, every week I'd go to a couple of different places just to see what's out there. And I came back with the idea that this is the most angry place I'd ever seen. Everybody was ticked off. So, as luck would have it, by the great diversity that is our country, I had an intel officer or a U.S. Army captain who happened to have grown up in Afghanistan. I didn't realize that until I got to know him. He and I went on one of these battlefield circulations. It's kind of a funny story on the Hindu Kush, in the one of the passageways through the Hindu Kush into Afghanistan. And he looked around, as we all did, because it's spectacular. He said, "Wow, I haven't been here since I was about 14." And I looked at him and said, "What?"
Wow.
He said, "Yeah, when I was 14, my grandparents and my parents loaded up everything we had on some camels and we walked to Pakistan." So with that, I gave him a helicopter and an A-team and about 2 or 3 weeks. And I said, travel the country and answer one question. Why is everybody so angry? So he came back with a very detailed report that listed about 4 or 5 reasons why people were angry. There's no rule of law, no health care, no education, no security. So I said, okay, so which one of those can we, or how many of those can we try to fix? Okay, we can't fix all of them, obviously. So we tried to fix each of those things because the truism is angry people don't fight.
Mm.
Okay, you and I have frustrations in life, but you know what? We're not blowing up the kids down the street or whatever. Some people are, thank goodness, and they just need to be squashed. But by and large, happy people don't fight.
Mm,
So that is really the root of unconventional warfare. Figure out why people are angry, see what we can do to make them less angry, or at least make them bring them on our side, and then facilitate their success.
I'm hearing a couple things. One is, you described the hatred that people have for the Russians, and so that's a response to things the Russians did. What I'm hearing you say is the ideal would have been, and perhaps this is happening to some extent now, because I know some schools are built and medical supplies are brought in, et cetera. But the goal would have been for the Afghans to look at each other when there weren't any Americans around and say, well, maybe we're not super thrilled about the Americans, but we do have to admit things have gotten a little bit better since they came. And there's some buy-in. So maybe with these Americans and their allies, maybe what they're selling, maybe that's the way forward. That's kind of what you're saying, right? I mean, get
Yeah,
that.
admittedly, that's a hard sell in the Islamic world. The
Mm,
West is looking forward, and Islam is looking to the year 600 when Muhammad walked the earth. So a lot of
mm,
the things that you and I think of as progress, they think of as bad. When I was in Afghanistan, we had a very small American footprint, just a few thousand. 10 years later, we had 50, 60, 70,000. So pretty soon, it went from the Americans kind of facilitating you doing stuff to the Americans just doing stuff. And
mm,
Afghans are like anybody else. I will watch somebody else do my work all day long. No problem. I can sit on my couch and watch you cut my grass all day long. But that's not the answer, of course. The answer is for you maybe to help me figure out how to cut the grass in that metaphor.
mm.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and something else I was thinking, this feeling that, Afghan culture is so radically different, so alien. You've said it yourself. I mean, it's something out of the Old Testament. I've heard that kind of thing so many times. But it sounds like what you're saying is, the ideal would have been, and this takes a lot of time and a lot of work and a lot of patience, but to find those common points, that we must share as humans, as radically different as our cultures are, there must be some things that we have in common. A desire for security, a desire for order, a desire for some predictability, a desire for some fairness. Um, and these are the kinds of things that you tap into. Is that kind of what you're saying?
yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. Identify those common uh, needs and requirements and scratch those itches. Now, again, very hard in the Islamic world, very hard in Afghanistan because those counter to us, the Taliban was so draconian and is so draconian. Um, any hint of supporting a Western mindset is immediate execution in the most horrible possible way. So again, very much of an uphill battle on our case. But we did early on, just heck, 3 years after 9/11, the Afghans had a legitimate election. They had an election, and we had a pretty small American footprint throughout that period because early on, you remember just a month after 9/11, nobody was in Afghanistan except Special Operations Forces.
Right.
And we probably should have kind of left it at that, maybe not those numbers, but that concept, because it went downhill soon after the pendulum of American authority shifted.
What do you think would have been the greatest challenges? I think, for example, if I remember correctly, you write that long spaces of time would go by without you even seeing an Afghan woman. Um, just the fact that Afghan women, other than girls, I think you mentioned you'd see girls, but then they get to a certain age and then they're sequestered. They can't go out without male supervision. They have to be completely covered. I mean, is that an example of something that is that something that you just leave alone because it's so deeply entrenched in the culture? Is it something you work with?
Yeah,
What's that kind of thing?
that's so deeply entrenched in their culture. I think to try to adjust that would be, not feasible and very detrimental. certainly in the short term. Maybe 100 years from now, I don't know.
Right.
But you're right. I saw no women of, I'll say, childbearing years. Saw a bunch of little girls, just like our little girls, beautiful, cute, happy, running and playing. I saw a couple of, I'll say, very old women. They were probably 50, but they looked 80 or 90. Everybody else was sequestered, and it hit me. So 50% of the population is basically grounded. You know, when you were a teenager, maybe you got grounded if you did something wrong. So they're grounded from almost from day one, which writes off 50% of the intellectual capital and 50% of the inventions and all that stuff. Uh, but again, that's not necessarily our problem to change. That's a challenge in the environment in which we work, because strategically, I think all we should have tried to do in Afghanistan was to negate it as a launch point from which our democracy could be attacked. That's
Right.
very tempting. And I was tempted, I'm sure, fell into this temptation to try to solve somebody else's problems. But that's not really the job. The job is to try to negate their problems from attacking us. And I think we could have done that. It's a question about level of chaos. In our society, we'll accept minimal chaos. In their society, they'll accept lots of chaos. So kind of where's that happy medium? It's not realistic to expect them to get down to a Western level of chaos. But you know what? If they get down to only the police chiefs are bribable sometime, maybe that's okay. Not okay here, but over there, maybe that's a huge victory.
The goal from a national security perspective being to reduce the extent to which Afghanistan is a threat to us, and the goal not being to turn Afghanistan into the mirror image of us.
Certainly not the short term.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's certainly not an acceptable short term. I think we tried to do that to some extent, and the pushback was so hard that you see what happened.
So from that perspective, then, I remember the news about the number of girls going to school is rising dramatically, and that sounded great. But now as I'm talking to you, I'm thinking, well, as hard as and as unpleasant as it is to think and to say it, maybe that was a mistake, because if their perceptions of women are so deeply entrenched, if we counter that so quickly, it's going to be, as much as we like that, it's going to be counterproductive, because the locals are going to feel like we are stepping all over their culture.
Yeah,
It's going to feel more like an intrusion than it is aid, more, if that, does that make sense? Do you think that's right?
I think you're right. I think we segued from overthrowing the Taliban and providing somewhat of a stable environment into this whole Jeffersonian democracy thing, which includes, although you and I love to see girls in school, of course you want girls in school. Um, but for them at this point, I think that was a bridge too far. I'll give you an example. We went uh, way up in the mountains, away from any remote civilization, and ran into a little boy, probably 14 years old, wearing a Dallas Cowboys T-shirt
Mhm.
and a Marlboro cigarette hat. Clearly, this kid had no idea what the Dallas Cowboys were, or what Marlboro cigarettes. Right? No idea. Who knows how he got them? Maybe through some kind of clothing Red Cross distribution thing. From his perspective, that was the coolest thing ever. I'm wearing a cowboy shirt. From his parents' perspective, that was a radical Western invasion into their family to put that horrible Western culture on my boy's back, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
oddly enough, he thought we were Germans, just because I guess he'd seen some Germans drive through the area, and we kind of look German, and that all sounds German if you're speaking Pashtun, of course. So, but that's a good example, I think, of the invasion, not deliberate, but the accidental invasion of the information uh, element of national power, as well as the commercial element of national power. Nobody said, hey, let's give them a bunch of Dallas Cowboy t-shirts and slowly try to change their mind. It just kind of spread like wildfire. Who knows?
Now, when did you actually arrive in Afghanistan?
I got there the summer of '03 and left a year later, summer of '04. So I spent the second anniversary of 9/11 on the top, on the roof of an old Soviet bunker uh, near Kabul.
Wow. When you left Afghanistan after your tour, so the summer of 2004, what was your assessment? Were you fairly comfortable?
Yeah, I was pretty confident that they were going in the right direction. They successfully held elections. I think 6 months or so after I got home, we helped kind of set the stage for that. We still had a very small American military presence, relatively. I think we had about two infantry brigades, an aviation brigade, and probably a support brigade. So roughly a division-sized force, in addition to my force. Um, that number got dramatically bigger over, follow-on leaders who said we need to surge and we need to just wipe them out, not realizing that's not the case.
As the years are going by, are you trying to, make this argument? Are you talking to other officers, talking to people of influence, trying to say, look, we're going at this the wrong way?
I talk to anybody who will listen. I don't know that a lot of people are listening. The short spiel is we didn't fight it poorly. We fought it incorrectly. We fought it with the wrong main effort, a large conventional America will fix it main effort, as opposed to a much smaller indirect main effort.
Yeah.
I liken. Uh, I'm arguing for judo, and they're arguing for karate, and to segregate those two martial arts. Judo basically uses the momentum of the attacker against the attacker. In judo, there are almost no punches or kicks. Simply, someone charges you, you take their momentum and turn it against them and put them on the ground. Whereas karate, it's all about a deliberate kick or punch, which is what America. That's the way we like to fight wars: get in there, kick some butt, and then call it a day.
What price do you think the country has paid for the way the effort in Afghanistan was prosecuted? And we all saw the end on August 21. No one, I don't think anybody can walk away from that and stamp the word success on that. So what price, from your perspective, has the country paid for the way it prosecuted that war in Afghanistan?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think probably the biggest price is a lack of confidence in leadership. And again, a 20-year war encompasses a lot of leadership, right? Multiple presidents and generals and senators, et cetera. But a lack of confidence in the system that drives us and controls us during war. So much to the extent that no matter what it is, I'm not going. No matter what the cause, what the initiating impact is, it's not worth it. It'll end poorly, and I'm not going. Conversely, though, look right after 9/11, and America, we couldn't get revenge fast enough.
Mm.
I mean, the country was like, "Let's go now. Put me in, coach. Let's go." And I think now, certainly immediately after the fall of Afghanistan, we had the opposite uh, perspective. I think personally, bitter over a couple of things. I don't know if bitter is the right word for me, but hurt. One is the absolute abortive way we got out of Afghanistan. It couldn't have been any worse. You could not have written the screenplay with a worse ending than that. And two, I think one of our strategic challenges, not only the strategy in general, but America was never mobilized for this war. Everybody who went volunteered. The soldiers that went to Vietnam, many of them were drafted, obviously Korea, World War II, et cetera, and the whole country was in. But in Afghanistan, everybody volunteered. So you come home with an attitude that said, wait a minute, I volunteered for that while you were sitting back here not doing anything. I know when I came home, I asked some of my civilian friends, I said, so what are your thoughts about the war? What do you guys think about it? And they said, well, in all honesty, we don't think about it. And I was, how can that be? I mean, we've got troops in combat. What do you mean you don't think about it? But since it didn't impact their sons and daughters because we all volunteered, I had other people say, well, hey, that's what you guys volunteered for. Don't come complain to us. This is what you volunteered for. So I think that's a risk when America goes to war without the sons and daughters.